let's get started again. Today, our next topic today, still setting the context, is Luther's family, childhood, his upbringing, and especially his education that will occupy us. As we know, we are not only the product of our time, the time in which we live, as we've tried to describe. We are also the product of our family of origin, as psychologists sometimes call it. Biographers, again, there are many biographers of Luther now, as well as in previous generations, have been very interested in Luther's personality development on his road to Reformation, road to becoming a reformer. I would like to mention just a few books. Whether you can get a hold of a good biography of Luther during this course or read it right after, I think it'd be a great idea just to engage in some reading about Luther and even some of Luther's writings in connection with our time here. And one recent biography I could really recommend is one by my doctoral advisor, Scott Hendricks, published in 2015, Martin Luther, Visionary Reformer. That I think is a really solid biography of Luther, and that concentrates a lot on his theological development, but very interestingly also understands Luther not as a solo figure, but as a man with a very important community of people around him that were also very influential in his development and in the development of the Reformation. If we look at some of the titles of other books about Luther, or biographies of Luther, we get some ideas of how Luther has been perceived. A book from about 30 years ago, in its original German and then quickly translated in English, has the title Luther, Man Between God and the Devil, by Heiko Obermann, who was actually Scott Hendricks' doctor advisor. And so we had two generations here. And this idea of Luther as a man caught between powerful forces, God and the devil, is very influential. In a way, this isn't really a biography as much as it is a view of the mentality of the whole time era, with Luther as a central focus, to be sure, but an interpretation of an age. One of the classics in the English language is an older biography, still I think quite useful, but has some of the Luther lore, Luther legends that Hendricks and other modern scholars try to get away from. But Roland Bainton, a scholar that taught at Yale University for many years, his book, Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther, published in 1950, is still a classic of biographies of Luther. But two other recent biographies I think have interesting titles. This one I'm just reading now. Heinz Schilling, a German historian, published this about 5 years ago, but now translated into English just this year. Martin Luther, Rebel in an Age of Upheaval. So you get a particular take, not even called a reformer here, but rebel. And what does that mean for a historian looking at Luther and his time? This is a pretty thick biography, as you can see, and it's quite expansive in its, at least as far as I've gotten so far, in not only looking at Luther, but the Reformation as a historical event, as an epic. And finally, and I'll mention some details about this, another one with an interesting title, Martin Luther, Renegade and Prophet, by an Australian historian, feminist historian, Lyndall Roper, who teaches at the University of Oxford. And she adopts something I'm rather surprised she does, because it was kind of soundly rejected among previous biographers. But in the 1960s, an American psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson wrote a biography of Luther called Young Man Luther. And Erikson, as a psychoanalyst, a Freudian, actually developed his own understanding of psychoanalysis, so we would call it Ericksonian psychoanalysis, tried to take Luther as a patient, as it were, through his words recorded by others, and through his letters, etc. And came to a particular view of Luther's relationship with his parents, in particular Luther's father, that led him to a conclusion that Luther did suffer from a psychosis, as it were, of an unresolved conflict with his father that led him to to rebel against his father and later to rebel against the Pope. The Reformation is a result of this unresolved personality problem of a young man, Luther. And Lyndall Roper actually adopts that, surprisingly so, because again, historians are a little more cautious today usually about how effectively can a psychoanalysis be given of a man who lived 500 years ago in very different conditions, and we can't interview him personally. But she gives this title, Renegade and Prophet, and says Luther entered the monastery to rebel against his father. And we'll look at some of that, but it's an interesting dynamic. Well, what about Luther's father? Hans Luther. Portrayed here just a few years before he died. In fact, inscribed at the top is the announcement of his death in 1530. But this is a painting by the court painter Lucas Cranach, a citizen and even mayor, Burgermeister in Wittenberg during Luther's lifetime. A painting of Luther's father as an older man. Luther once called himself the son of a peasant. Not really accurate. Hans Luther was born the son of a peasant, but free peasants. They weren't tied to the land, they actually owned property. But Hans Luther was the eldest son, or eldest surviving son at least. And according to the laws of Möra in Thuringia, where he lived, or Thuringia, it was the youngest son who inherited the family farm. And so Hans, sometime before Luther was born, had to decide whether to work for his younger brother the rest of his life or to go out on his own. And he ended up marrying at the age of 20, I understand, to a woman of some means from a neighboring town to Möra of Eisenach. And he went into the mining business and moved to a more successful mining area farther to the northeast from Möra, Mansfeld, and became a successful entrepreneur in the mining business, which in the early 16th century was profitable. And this is very important for understanding Luther's upbringing. He came from poverty, but up and up poverty. His father was able to invest a lot into his eldest surviving son. We believe eldest son, but it's possible Luther had an older brother that died very early. But probably certainly Martin was the eldest son growing up, and Hans invested a lot of his resources that he had managed to scrape together as an entrepreneur in the copper mining business, putting his son to school, which was very important, and as we discussed before, not a common reality for the lower or middling classes of developing German culture in the 16th century. Luther is portrayed here as maybe a little bit worried looking, and it's true that mining became less profitable later in his life, by the later 1520s, largely because of influx of silver from the New World that was messing up the profitability of silver mining and destabilizing the prices of silver and copper and other related mines in Germany at the time. And it's quite possible that later in his life, Hans Luther was struggling a little bit and still perhaps resented that his son had changed his plans, as we'll talk about in a little. Next is Martin's mother. Oh, so there's Möra, by the way. Möra is in almost the geographical center of Germany, the middle star there, in the countryside of Thuringia. And Luther spends most of his adult life in Wittenberg to the northeast of that. We'll see it's a pretty small circle in Germany where Luther spends his life. Hans, Martin's father, married a Margareta Lindemann of the Lindemann family of Eisenach when Martin was about 20. I'm not sure how old Margareta was. But she had some connections. Her father was of the town council of Eisenach. And so this was an example of a man from a peasant farming background marrying a burgher's daughter. Most of us marry up. right? Most men marry up. And Luther's father did. And it's believed that the Lindemann connections were instrumental in getting Hans Luther started in his mining operation. Luther talked about his parents as being very strict. He described once how his mother beat him to the point of bleeding for stealing a nut, a walnut. His father scared him away once so that he ran away for not long, but he was afraid of his father for a time. But those things were not unusual. I mean, this was a very typical, strict German family in the late Middle Ages that Luther was raised in. And it's very clear from his late letters to his parents. We have a letter that he wrote to his father just before his father died, and another after his father died, in which he very much grieved, that show a man with a very dear relationship to his father, even though we'll see there was some stress in that relationship at a certain point in Luther's time. Luther certainly respected his mother and saw her responsibility in the household and such as kind of a model for his own household when he, as an older man, married Katharina Luther, and I think encouraged his wife to be the same kind of strong mother, household leader that he saw in his own mother. Well, shortly before Martin was born in 1483, the Luthers left Möhre, where they were married, and went to Eisleben, and that's where Luther was born. And soon after he was born, they moved to Mansfeld, just to the northwest of Eisleben. So the direction from Möhre northeast to Eisleben, and then to Mansfeld. It's possible Luther was actually born in 1484. There's just different sources, different recollections from his mother and himself as to the year. But it's never given as about 1483. 1483 is generally accepted as Luther's birth date and birth year, and November 10th, very likely, because then he was baptized on November 11th, the feast day of Saint Martin, and that's the background for him being named Martin, in memory of and celebration of the saint from the late Roman Empire that had been revered for centuries in Germany and other parts of Europe. So Martin Luther of Mansfeld, grows up in this small town after being born. Let's show a few pictures of Eisleben. This is the town as it appeared until recently. This is the former East Germany, these areas of Thuringia and Saxony. Next shows some more recent pictures. The house that Luther was born in was preserved for a time, but burned down in the 17th century and has been rebuilt again. But there is a museum there, Martin Luther's birthplace, it says, and right next to the church where he was baptized. Next picture shows us that area as it appears just a month ago, or 2 months ago when I was there. I took these few photos here. Eisleben is a small town, but nonetheless has its own Augustinian cloister at the time, several other important things. And very importantly, of course, the town church next, where Luther was baptized. Oh, there's the house as it's reconstructed. Originally, again, in the 17th century. And all of these things, by the way, have been refurbished, beautifully restored in anticipation of this year, the big Luther year. So it's a great time to go to Germany and visit some of these places if you haven't done it recently. Things are spiffied up pretty nicely, and there's some really, really wonderful museum exhibitions and sites to see. Next. Luther was born, was baptized then in the Church of Saints Peter and Paul on the feast of Saint Martin, November 11th. And that church is preserved. He was baptized next in the tower chapel of that church. There's in the Turmkapelle, the tower chapel, he was born on, or baptized on the 11th of November. And next, and inside here, this is the way that little chapel in the tower looks today. Probably that altarpiece was there at the time, although I can't guarantee. But not the font. That's a different font because next, in the church as it's beautifully restored, just in the last 5 years, I think, they have not only this great big baptismal font in the floor in the front, having been recently made, but they also have this baptismal font which is said to contain pieces of the original font that was used to baptize Luther and was destroyed. They constructed a new font with little pieces of it in there. Isn't that something?
Relics?
Yes. Okay.
A couple years separated?
Well, so as I mentioned, not long after Luther was born, the family moved to Mansfeld, again in the countryside. Mansfeld, again, a successful or prosperous at the time mining community, and that's where Hans sets up his entrepreneurial business over the course of the next decades. So again, a map just showing, again, this rather small area in which Luther lives his whole life. The Luther home in Mansfeld has been preserved, and that's the way it looks. That's the one of the few Luther towns I haven't been to, actually. So that's a stock photo I got from somebody else. But at Luther's first schooling was connected to the St. George's Church in Mansfeld. And next we have various records. Some of these dates disputed, but we have a pretty good idea that Luther probably began schooling at the age of 7 in Mansfeld in the Latin school of this town, connected to the church. Latin school, I emphasize that because that was the education for a person to be educated and hopefully to rise up as an educated person in society. One's education was grounded in Latin grammar and similar subjects. If it was indeed in the year 1491, traditionally schooling started on St. Gregory's Day, so Luther at the age of 7 on the 12th of March began his schooling in the little Latin school at Mansfeld. And go ahead, do the next several. The curriculum of a Latin school throughout the empire at this time was known as the trivium, the 3 ways, trivia. Grammar, logic, or dialectics as it's called at the university level, and rhetoric. What we call the 3 R's is to them the 3 ways: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This is the Latin school as it's been recently restored in Mansfeld. Luther later does talk about his life as a child, and so he didn't have much good to say about his teachers. School was hell in purgatory. He said, "We were tormented with casualibus and temporalibus." These are Latin terms of grammar and logic that he uses. "And yet learned less than nothing, despite all the flogging, trembling, anguish, and misery." Philip Melanchthon, Luther's younger colleague at the University of Wittenberg later, was a young prodigy, a genius, who I read recently that when he was like 8 years old, he was already memorizing his Latin conjugations, etc. And whenever he didn't get something exactly right, he was smacked by his teacher on the wrist. You know, this was just the way it was done. And it wasn't very pleasant. But Luther spent several years in the Latin school in Mansfeld before he was sent to a better school in Magdeburg, a cathedral town. And most universities in Europe developed out of a cathedral school in the High Middle Ages. Magdeburg had a cathedral school. We believe that's probably where Luther studied at Magdeburg. And we know that he was living with the brethren of the common life. That's that devotio moderna movement of lay people, but serious about the Christian life. And they didn't have schools of their own, but they often provided residence for young boys going to school away from home. And there are records that say he lived with the brethren of the common life. And probably then he studied at the cathedral school in Magdeburg. Magdeburg, a very important cathedral city. Go on through the next several. It's to the north of Mansfeld, so he's away from home. And he only stays in Magdeburg for a year. But this is a very dynamic place. A cathedral, a bishop, an archbishop, in fact, a cloister. This is the cloister right alongside the cathedral. So this is the environment in which Luther went to school for about a year in Magdeburg. Before, family arrangements probably led him, or his family I should say, to send him a little farther away to Eisenach, his mother's hometown, where he probably lived with relatives, the Schaub family. Go ahead. This is the house of Heinrich Schaube, related to the Lindemann family. And he went to school there about 3 years or 2.5 years. And this was a much better school than certainly the Mansfeld school. And probably because of the family connections, more affordable, and why Luther finished his preparatory schooling in Eisenach by 1501. So Luther is receiving, or has received by this time, the traditional education of somebody that could prepare to go to university. And that was his father's plan. We call it Social Security, or your pension. Hans Luther knew that if he was going to live okay in an old age, he had to make sure his kids took care of him. And his oldest son, Martin, he wanted to train to be a lawyer and to be a successful professional, educated man who could then take care of his family, his parents in their old age. And so Luther went then in 1501 to the university. Oh, this is still the Schaub place in Eisenach. Oh, by the way, real quick, go back to that one more. I'm getting ahead of myself. At the School of St. George in Eisenach, quite typically, Luther and the boys would go around singing for their bread. It was a kind of begging, but it was just the way things were done. And what's important here is not only Luther gets used to traveling around with buds and singing and engaging in that kind of activity, but he develops a love for and talent in music from his early schooling, and this is already displayed in kind of the traditions about Luther's experience at the School of St. George in Eisenach. Okay. Luther does have some reflections on his schooling in Eisenach. I just put the dates of his educational years there as we best guess them. But he does talk about, in some later sources, about the local parish priest in Eisenach that he respected a great deal, Johann Braun. When Luther was ordained and had his first Mass in 1507, he invited Braun to come. And I believe he did, and that was important. He talks about two of his teachers, Johann Trebonius, who was the headmaster of the school, and Wigan Geldenluf, one of the teachers. And Luther does, as an older man, or as a mature man, talk about how he learned from them to love the classical poets, the Latin poets of the Roman time. He grew to love Aesop's fables. He even published his own little edition of Aesop later in life as a reformer. You know Aesop's fables, right? So, again, this is at a lower level, this humanist interest in the classical world that is being groomed in him as a child through the traditional Latin schooling. Okay. So in May 1501, after these years of schooling, Luther's still a fairly young man, he enters the University of Erfurt. Erfurt is one of the larger cities in Germany. Again, a very important cathedral town with a bishop and a university. One of the oldest universities in Germany, 1379, I think it was founded. Much older than the University of Wittenberg, where Luther goes later, which was founded only in 1502. So it wasn't even there when Luther began his schooling. But Erfurt, as you see on the map, is farther to the south and west than Möhre was, or Wittenberg, and actually maybe a little bit north of Möhre. Möhre is not even on that map, but again, you're in this area of Thuringia, which is under the rule of the electors of Saxony, and part of the former East Germany when Germany was divided in the post-war period. So again, Luther's travels. there you go. It's to the east of Eisenach and Möhre, Erfurt is. Here are some recent pictures of the cathedral town. There's the cathedral on the left and a church of St. Severus, I think, just right next to it. Still today, two active congregations, that of the bishop and others.
Yeah.
What would Luther do as a university student? Well, the trivium, that three ways, would still be the essential curriculum. Continued more advanced study of grammar, dialectic, or what we call logic, and rhetoric, the way of speaking and writing well and convincingly. But at the university level, the 7 liberal arts were of the ancient world that were passed down throughout the Middle Ages. The trivium was complemented by the other 4 of the total of 7, known as the quadrivium, the 4 ways. So now there was advanced studies in arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Music, remember, is applied physics. And so they studied music not only for performance, and for theory, but also for understanding the mechanics of sound. And using ancient texts largely for this analysis. This picture just is, I think it's one of the university classrooms today, but just shows the kind of way things are structured in a medieval university. The town, the university right in the middle of the town with buildings kind of scattered around, not a one place off to the side, but really part of the town, very much in Erfurt, was this medieval university. Here are some of the buildings. This is an old picture of it before it was destroyed by Allied bombing during World War II. But then that was rebuilt partially at first, as you see here. But what's important in the text there, the handwritten manuscript, is it's the university record of May 1501, the spring semester of 1501, when, or summer semester they called it, when Martinus Luther de Mansfeld, Martin Luther of Mansfeld, is entered into the record as matriculating, or beginning formally his studies at the University of Erfurt. And again, in recent years, some of the main university buildings, including this one, have been restored. Here are some other structures: the University or Collegiate Chapel, St. Michael's. Okay. The Bursa, that is several buildings actually, which would be housing and cafeteria type, where the students lived and ate in community. Luther talks about 2 places. One of them, St. George's, the other called Heaven's Gate, and we're kind of guessing as to which building is which. But these were bursa, or different residential communal buildings of the university where Luther lived, perhaps in both, during the course of his several years at the University of Erfurt. So what was the reigning philosophy of education? Luther would have, as all university students, begin with a Bachelor of Arts degree, continue, if he was going on, to a Master of Arts degree, followed by, if he was to go on, one of 3 professional doctoral programs in either law, medicine, or theology. So all university studies began with a Bachelor of Arts, essentially in philosophy. And all of what we call the arts or humanities and sciences, what we call the sciences, are all part of philosophy as the subject matter of your first and second degree at the university. So Luther studied philosophy, and throughout the Middle Ages there have developed basic ways that philosophy understands the reality of the world God has created that are influential in what is called scholasticism. Scholasticism, the thinking of the schools, that is the universities. Philosophically, at the back of scholasticism in the Middle Ages was the late antique version of the Platonic tradition, going all the way back to Plato, but developed in the 3rd and 4th century by such philosophers as Plotinus and Porphyry, and then Christian theologians like St. Augustine and various others. And they have interpreted God and God's creation under an understanding that what is really real is God and the ideas behind all things, what were called universals or ideals. Plato called them the forms or the ideas. And you are a human being because you participate in the idea in the mind of God, the universal idea called humanity. And that's what's really real. You're real, then, only insofar as you participate in God's idea of what it means to be a human being. And this podium is a podium because it participates in the idea of podiumness. Okay, it's a universal. Neoplatonism had an understanding that all particular things, particular souls, you and I have souls, we are on a journey back to our real being, our real reality, which is with God, in God. And Neoplatonists, whether they're philosophers like Plotinus and pagans, or they're theologians like St. Augustine and have Christianized this idea, every human soul is on a journey. Because of sin, since Adam, we are on a journey first away from God. And the story of salvation is how God, by His grace, has turned us around, and we're now on a journey back to God, back to being, back to what the medieval theologians called the beatific vision, when we actually see God as He is. And as St. John says in his first epistle, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. So this philosophy, going back to the pagans, Plato and Porphyry and Plotinus, has been Christianized, and it's really operating in all of education and the intelligentsia throughout the Middle Ages. But in the High Middle Ages, specifically the 12th and 13th centuries, largely through contacts in Spain with Jewish and Muslim scholars, there's something new added to this Platonic tradition, namely the rediscovery and translation into Latin of Aristotle's works. The Neoplatonists knew Aristotle, and they used Aristotle. And though Aristotle saw himself criticizing his teacher, Plato, the Neoplatonist movement always interpreted the two kind of in conformity with each other. Well, and that's what the scholastic tradition ended up continuing. The idea that the Aristotelian traditions of philosophy are to be understood in this broader Neoplatonic understanding of what is real. And this developed in the Middle Ages into the scholastic schools, or parties, we might call them, factions, within many a medieval university. In the 12th and 13th centuries, develops the great philosophical school dominated by the Dominican theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas from the University of Paris. And then others that are Thomists that follow this tradition. And by Luther's time, in the late Middle Ages, they are known as the Old Way, the Via Antiqua, the Thomists. And they understand reality very much along the line of this Neoplatonic view of universals. That what is really real is the universal. That is, by the way, Thomas was condemned by several faculties late in his life or soon after his death. But as things worked out, Thomas's philosophy became very influential throughout the Middle Ages, and even today is regarded, especially in the Catholic tradition, as the greatest synthesis of knowledge between Christian revelation and theology and science or philosophy in the history of the world. And Thomism is celebrated since the 19th century as this great Catholic reality. In Luther's time, however, it was one of two major philosophical schools dominating the universities. The other being the modern way, the Via Moderna, influenced by a Franciscan scholar from England by the name of William of Ockham. And I'm not, since we're running short on time, I'm not going to get too far into things, but Ockham disputes the synthesis, the grand synthesis of Thomism. And at its heart is his belief that these universals actually don't exist. What exists is the individual thing that God creates and brings into being through his word. So you're not a human being because you participate in this idea, a universal called humanity. Humanity is just a name that we give when we look at lots of humans and say, well, what is that? What does every human have in common? That we create a universal. We give a name to it. The universal doesn't actually exist. And therefore, this via moderna is also called nominalism, from the Latin nomina, to give it a name. Nominalism. I'm not going to read that because we're running out of time, but it's a denial that universals exist. Luther, next slide, is trained at the University of Erfurt, both at the philosophy, in the philosophy faculty and later in the theology faculty, by this dominant school at Erfurt. Like most universities, both schools were active, the Thomist via Antiqua and the nominalist via Moderna. But I think it's pretty clear that Luther's teachers, both in philosophy but especially theology, were in the Ockhamist camp. And we've lost our... That's okay. I can keep going. What goes on then, as Luther goes through his bachelor's studies, he is exposed to this whole development. He goes through a typical curriculum of great works, great books that he's studying. He graduates after 3 semesters, I think it is, in September of 1502 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, ranking 30th in a class of 57, so no star student, but competent. And then he goes along farther through to master's studies. And here we have a pretty clear curriculum, or idea of what he actually studied. He took lectures then on several books of Aristotle. His topics, which talk about logic. Aristotle's understanding of natural philosophy, what we call science today. His book on the heavens, on generation and corruption, on the soul, on the little physical things. These are all books by Aristotle that have been recently, just a couple hundred years, restored in their fullness and translated into Latin and become dominant in the curriculum of the university. Then he took 6 months of lectures on Aristotle's metaphysics, another 8 months on his ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, 6 months on Aristotle's politics, a month on his economics, all Aristotle. Some observations of this university's education are that Aristotle reigns in the medieval university, both at the philosophy level and, as we'll learn later next week, in the study of theology. And Luther is being trained as a nominalist to understand the importance of words. If universals don't exist, but God creates individual things by speaking them into existence, and God said, "Let there be light," and there is light. Those words are what bring reality into being. And the nominalist philosophy is very interested in the power of words. That's still influential, by the way, in academic studies and linguistics today. A scholastic maxim or motto at the time of Luther was, "No one becomes a doctor of theology without Aristotle." That's how dominant Aristotle's work was. And again, not only in philosophy and science, but in theology. Given that Aristotle was not a Christian, but a pagan philosopher. That is a very significant reality. But we need to understand these books are being commented on and taught from the perspective of Christian theologians and philosophers that are, we can say, baptizing Aristotle's work with a Christian worldview. Luther does talk about some of his teachers, Jodocus Trotvetter, who we don't know too much about, but we do know from Luther at least that he emphasized very strongly that faith and what God teaches us in his word and believing that is important in the understanding of philosophy and science as well as theology. And his teacher Bartholomeus Arnoldi von Usingen was deeply influenced by the alchemist tradition and was somewhat critical of, used Aristotle more critically than the Thomist or Via Antiqua often did. And so Luther probably from him learned a certain criticism, critical thinking regarding this very influential ancient mind and his writings as he studied philosophy and later theology. Then there is clearly in Luther's time evidence that there was an active humanist movement among these scholars. The traditions of scholasticism are there and the dominant, but it's also clear that Luther meets some friends during his time, fellow students that are humanists. And the rector of the university was a humanist in Luther's time. And so he's being exposed to these ideas that we need to go beyond the traditional scholastic method of a lecturer who's lecturing on a book to a broader understanding of reading literature, going to the sources in a much broader way. And Luther is very much influenced by this. Later friends of Luther that he corresponds with throughout his adult life, he met at the University of Erfurt, and these became very committed humanists. Spalatin, George Burckhardt von Spalt, who became an advisor to Duke Frederick the Wise, Luther's protector, was a humanist trained at Erfurt. Johannes Lang, a brother Augustinian, was deeply committed to the principles of humanism and became a lifelong friend of Luther. And you met him first as a master's student. Again, we learned that Luther achieved a bachelor's degree by September 1502. He received his Master of Arts degree after somewhat longer study in January 1505, and now he's second in the class of 17. So he's showing his talents. And then he begins the professional study in the faculty of law. This was clearly his father's intention for him. His father presented him with a rather expensive book when he began his studies called The Body of Civil Law. And he invested in Luther in that way, and Martin, his son. But Luther is only in the law faculty in his first semester when clearly he has a crisis, a personal crisis. And we know about that because of what happened. He later does say things like this: "When I was a young master in Erfurt, I continually wandered about sadly because of the Anfechtung." That's a German word that means like spiritual assaults, sufferings. And Luther describes those as either from attacks from God or the devil, or both. Yeah, Heiko Obermann's book, Luther, Man Between God and the Devil, talks a lot about Luther's Anfechtung of sorrows. But here he says, "I continually wandered about sadly because of the Anfechtung of sorrows, so I devoted myself to much reading of the Bible." Clearly, Luther lived in a time when fear of death, fear of God, fear of judgment was a reality. It was portrayed in every church just about Jesus as the judge on the last day, separating those being condemned and thrown into the jaws of hell and blessing those on the lily side of Jesus' face. There's a sword coming out of one side of Jesus' face in these pictures, and a lily coming out of the other. You always wanted to be on the lily side, but you were never sure. Clearly, Luther is struggling spiritually. We know also that he takes a journey to Mansfeld, goes home. We don't know why. It's possible that he wanted to talk to his dad about this law program he's in, and he's not happy with it. Again, this is just his first semester in. It's possible that his father summoned him home to arrange a nice, successful marriage for him. We don't really have clear evidence of that, but there are some things he says that make that a possibility. What we do know is that he made this journey home to Mansfeld, and on the way back to the University of Erfurt, in a little outskirts of a little village called Stotternheim, Luther gets caught in a terrible thunderstorm. And you've probably seen it in Luther movies or read about it in books, but Luther is terrified as lightning is striking right around him, and he blurts out, "Help me, Saint Anne, I will become a monk." And he later says, "I took the vow for the sake of my salvation." He was terrified of the state of his soul, and believed, as many a person did in the Middle Ages, that the most certain route you could take to getting to heaven and being on the lily side of Jesus on Judgment Day was to enter the religious life. And so he chose the most strict monastery in the town of Erfurt, the university town where he was. He said goodbye to his friends. He gave away his possessions, including that expensive body of civil law that his father had given him. And he says to his friends, "After today, you won't see me again." And he entered the Augustinian cloister of the strict order, what called the German Reformed Congregation of Augustinian Hermits in Erfurt. Later he said, "Afterwards I regretted my vow, and many of my friends tried to persuade me not to enter the monastery. However, I was determined to go through with it. And the day before St. Alexius, I invited certain of my friends to a farewell party, and as on the next day they were to lead me into the priory, and to those I left behind I said, 'Today you see me for the last time, and then no more.' In tears they led me away, yet I persisted in my determination. It never occurred to me afterward to leave the monastery." And that's where we'll pick up next week, where Luther enters the Augustinian cloister in Erfurt and takes the steps leading him to become a monk, or more properly, a friar in the Augustinian, in the cloister of the Augustinian hermits in Erfurt. We have time for a couple questions.
So there were obviously a lot of classes on Aristotle.
Yes.
Were there classes on any of the biblical authors or church fathers that you could have attended? Or was it pretty much Aristotle or the Neoplatonists? Or?
In the curriculum Luther followed at Erfurt, apparently not. When you got to theology studies, there was the first degree. It was called the Baccalaureus Biblicus, and that gave you the right to lecture on the Bible. So certainly that takes place at some stage, but it is not dominant in the scholastic curriculum, even in theology, but certainly not in the arts faculty or the philosophy studies. Yeah. Yes?
Would you comment on the change from a D to a TH in Luther's name?
Yeah, that comes later, and so I will. But it's very important. Of course, in German, Luther, you can't spell it. You can't say a TH in German. It just doesn't happen. So it's Luther, even in German as it's spelled now. But yeah, there's a distinctive time when Luther changes his name and signs his name Martin Luther with a TH, and we'll talk about that. Either next time or the following. I think it's the following. But it's almost a Saul to Paul movement. So it's important.
question from online, which says, would Luther have read Dante's Inferno or the Divine Comedy?
That's a great question. I have no idea the answer to that. Dante, of course, was one of the great authors of the early Renaissance, and or before, I suppose. But no, I don't know the answer to that question. Again, we see Luther's preparatory education is broader as he's studying some of these classical fathers as a preparatory student. Then it appears his university education, which is dominated by the scholastic traditions. Even though there's this humanist movement brewing at Erfurt, which becomes influential in some sense, we should say that Luther did not receive a humanist education, but a scholastic education in philosophy or in arts, and then in theology at Erfurt. And that becomes important because when he later goes to Wittenberg, he actively seeks to change that curriculum to a humanist curriculum, much more focused on the Bible and the church fathers and literature as such, going to the sources, rather than just looking at Aristotle's books. And more importantly, especially for theology, most lectures were essentially a scholar commenting on Aristotle's books. So you weren't even so much studying Aristotle as you were that professor's commentary on Aristotle's books. So Aristotle's the basis, but there develops this whole tradition of how you teach this body of literature that is at the heart of scholasticism. And we will look at more at what scholasticism meant for Luther's theological education next week.
Again, thank you. You can see the wealth of knowledge and understanding that he has that helps us get a grasp for this significant turn of events and what it is that's part of our heritage. And he whetted your appetite to come back next week and the week after to find out about that significant name change. Again, I'm Dr. Jim Gimbel, president of the strict order of Edmontonian Hermits, also known as Concordia Lutheran Seminary. It is our mission to form servants for Jesus' sake, and if you're here, you can see that we have a number of our students who are in your midst, mixed among you. Make sure you get a chance to meet them, and they are the future leaders of the church, pastors of Lutheran Church Canada. We have a number of others who are online. But we're really thrilled to have them here and to be able to participate in this. It's our endeavor to continue to form servants for Jesus' sake, not only in the form of future pastors, but also informed laity. Everyone in the church who hears and understands and learns even better to treasure the gospel is blessed by this experience. So we're thankful for you for this. We're thankful for the whole Quest experience. Let's have a closing word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you again for bringing us here today, for the opportunity to learn, grow, and better understand the background and context for Martin Luther and the way that you would use him to be a leader in our church. Thank you for the treasure and the heritage we have. We ask that you would take us safely home this evening, give us a quiet evening's rest. Remind us as we fall asleep that we rest with you in the peace of the forgiveness of sin and the certainty of life everlasting. Guide, guard, and keep us, bless your church, and grant us a unity in what we believe, what we cling to, and the assurance we have as we walk together side by side on the journey through this life, the pilgrimage you've laid before us. Remind us of the great blessing that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. In his name we pray.